Today we're getting into one of the big ones, an idea that really shapes our entire modern world, John Stuart Mill's essay on liberty.
It's foundational, really. I mean, this text is the blueprint for so many arguments about free speech, personal choice, and, where we draw a line between what society can tell you to do and what's just your business.
Absolutely. And our mission for this deep dive is to get to the heart of Mill's biggest question. What are the rightful limits to society's power over you, the individual? Where does the government's or your neighbor's authority end and your own personal freedom begin?
And Mill saw this coming. He was writing in the mid-1800s, and he felt that as the old forms of tyranny, like kings and despots, were fading, something else, something maybe more dangerous, was rising up.
A social tyranny.
Exactly. He called it the vital question of the future. And to really get it, we have to start where he starts, by looking at how the whole fight for liberty had changed.
So right at the beginning of chapter 1, Mill makes it clear he's not talking about philosophical free will. This isn't some abstract debate.
No, not at all. He's focused on something very practical. Civil liberty or social liberty. It's all about the relationship between you and the power of your community.
And historically, that was a pretty simple fight, right?
Super simple. Liberty meant protection against political rulers. King and emperor, some ruling class. Their power was always seen as something that could be used against the people.
So patriots fought for liberty in what, two main ways?
Yeah. Basically, first you'd get the ruler to recognize certain immunities, what we now call basic rights that they just couldn't violate. And second, you'd set up constitutional checks like a parliament or some kind of representative body, so the ruler couldn't do big things without the people's consent.
Liberty was protection from the government.
Exactly. But then democracy comes along and just changes the whole game. The idea that the rulers are just delegates of the people, that they can be fired, basically, it led to this really dangerous new thought.
Which was, why do we need protection from ourselves?
Right. If the government is us, the nation isn't going to tyrannize itself.
Yeah.
It sounds logical, but Mill just saw right through that.
And he spots this massive fault line, the one we're still dealing with today, the tyranny of the majority.
Because self-government is a tricky phrase. The people with the power aren't always the same people who have the power used on them.
In reality, it's the government of each person by all the rest. The will of the people just means the will of the most numerous or maybe the loudest, most active part of the people, the majority.
And that majority can absolutely want to oppress a minority. So you need protection from the tyranny of the majority just as much as you needed it from a king. But Mill, he goes even deeper than that.
He does. He says the political tyranny isn't even the worst threat.
No. He brings up social tyranny. Society itself, he says, can be the tyrant. It doesn't use laws or penalties. It uses prevailing opinion. It uses social pressure.
And why is that more dangerous?
Because you can't escape it. There are, as he puts it, fewer means of escape. It gets into every part of your life. It can, and this is his phrase, enslave the soul itself.
Wow. Yeah, when society tells you what to think and how to feel through shame and judgment, it's not just controlling your actions, it's trying to control your very being.
And this is where Mill gets really critical. He says, the rules that society enforces on people, they're not based on some grand principle. They're usually just based on custom. And people mistake that custom for, the law of nature.
The guiding idea is just a feeling, a preference. The feeling that everyone should have to act the way I would act or the way my friends would act.
And that preference comes from all sorts of places, right? Class interest, religious prejudice, self-interest, it's a mess.
Right.
And Mill looked at Britain at the time and said, there's no recognized principle here at all. People just argue for or against government interference based on their personal feelings.
It's just gut reaction.
Total gut reaction. So Mill realized we need a principle, something clear and simple. And that, of course, is what becomes the harm principle.
The one simple principle.
Yes. The only reason anyone, the government or society, can interfere with your freedom of action is for self-protection. The only reason power can be used against you, against your will, is to prevent harm to others.
So if what I'm doing only harms myself, society has to leave me alone.
Completely. It can't force you to do something because it would be better for you or happier or wiser. It can try to persuade you, argue with you, but it cannot compel you.
That's the famous line, right? Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign.
That's the one. It's an absolute declaration of personal sovereignty.
Okay, we have to dig into this, though, because the foundation for this principle isn't what a lot of people might think. He doesn't base it on abstract natural rights like, say, the American founders did.
No, he's very explicit about that. He bases it on utility.
Which can sound a bit shaky to people. Utilitarianism is about the greatest good for the greatest number, right?
Right, but this is the key. Mill defines utility in a very specific way. He calls it utility in the largest sense, grounded on the permanent interests of man as a progressive being.
Okay, break that down. What does that actually mean?
It means he's not arguing that freedom just feels nice. He's arguing it's the most effective system for humanity to improve itself over the long haul, mentally, morally, socially.
So freedom is useful because it helps us grow as a species.
Precisely. But what about that classic objection? What if the majority decides that a little bit of oppression today would make everyone happier overall? Wouldn't a utilitarian have to accept that?
Yeah, that seems like a huge loophole.
But Mill closes it. He argues that any short-term happiness you might get from crushing someone's individuality is nothing compared to the long-term catastrophic damage you do to human progress. So for him, the harm principle becomes an absolute rule because, over the long run, always following it produces the greatest utility.
That's a really clever way to ground an absolute right in a practical system. So who does this apply to?
Adults, people in the maturity of their faculties. He says it doesn't apply to children, or to what he calls backward states of society, where people aren't yet capable of being guided by free discussion. In those cases, he says, a kind of benevolent despotism might be okay, but only if its goal is their improvement.
And once you're a mature adult in a civilized society, he lays out 3 specific areas of liberty where you are totally sovereign.
Yep. Number 1 is the inner world of consciousness, freedom of thought, of feeling, of opinion on everything, and crucially, the freedom to express and publish those opinions.
Second, liberty of tastes and pursuits. The freedom to plan your own life, to suit your own character, even if other people think you're being foolish or weird, as long as you're not harming them.
And third is the freedom of combination. Freedom to unite with other consenting adults for any purpose that doesn't cause harm.
So the big takeaway from this first chapter is that society is better off letting people be themselves rather than forcing everyone to be the same. And he ends with a pretty serious warning, doesn't he?
He does. He sees this trend, even among reformers, to stretch society's power over the individual, to push for more uniformity. And he says, we have to fight that.
And the first battlefield for that fight is in the mind.
So in chapter 2, Mill basically sets out to prove, beyond a doubt, that silencing any opinion, even if just one person holds it, is completely illegitimate.
And his argument is that it's a crime against all of humanity, right? Not just against the person you're silencing.
Exactly. He sets it up with 2 main possibilities. Let's say you silence an opinion. If that opinion is right, well, you've lost the chance to trade your error for the truth.
Okay, that's obvious enough.
But if the opinion is wrong, you still lose something. You lose what he calls the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth that comes from it colliding with error.
Let's unpack that. Let's start with the first case. The suppressed opinion might actually be true. This whole argument rests on the idea of human fallibility.
Right. We all say we know we're not perfect, that we can be wrong. But in practice, we tend to act like our little world, our country, our party, our social circle is infallible. We forget that every single age in history held beliefs that future ages found to be completely ridiculous.
So silencing an opinion is basically an assumption of infallibility. You're acting like you can't possibly be wrong.
But a critic could say, hang on, governments have to act on their best judgment. If they think an idea is dangerous, they have to do something. You can't just wait for absolute certainty on everything.
That's a fair point. How does Mill answer that?
It's a brilliant distinction. He says there's a world of difference between assuming an opinion is true because it has survived every attempt to refute it in open debate versus assuming it's true for the purpose of preventing anyone from trying to refute it.
So one is rational confidence, the other is just tyranny.
Exactly. The only way we can ever be justified in thinking we're right is if we've allowed for complete freedom to prove us wrong. Mill says the only way a person gets wise is by keeping their mind open to criticism, by listening to all sides, especially the sides they disagree with.
If you've only ever heard your own side of the argument, your certainty is basically worthless.
Totally unjustified. And to show how serious this is, he gives these 3 devastating historical examples.
First is Socrates.
Right. Executed for impiety, for corrupting the youth. And the people who condemned him weren't monsters. They were respected citizens of Athens. They were just wrong.
Then crazy.
Put to death as a blasphemer. Again, by people who sincerely believed they were upholding religious and moral truth. People who, in any other context, would be seen as good, respectable individuals.
But the third one is the one that really hits home. Marcus Aurelius.
The best of the best.
Yeah.
A philosopher king. Gentle, virtuous, brilliant. And he persecuted Christians.
Why? Why would a man like that do it?
Out of a sense of duty. He honestly believed Christianity was going to tear society apart. Mill uses him as the ultimate example to show that even the best, most conscientious people can make a catastrophic error if they assume they have the right to suppress an opinion they think is dangerous.
So unless you think you're wiser and better than Marcus Aurelius, you should probably hesitate before silencing someone.
That's the point. And this leads him to take on that old saying that truth always triumphs over persecution.
Which he calls a pleasant falsehood.
He does. He says history is full of times when truth was stamped out for centuries. The Reformation was crushed multiple times before Luther. Protestantism was completely wiped out in Spain.
So truth only wins if the conditions are right, if it gets a chance to take root.
Right. Persecution works often enough that we should be terrified of it. Now, in his time, he says the persecution is different. It's not usually legal penalties anymore. The real problem is social stigma.
The modern majority doesn't execute heretics, it just makes their lives miserable.
Exactly. So people just keep quiet. Heretical ideas don't get a public hearing. They just smolder among small groups of thinkers. And the damage isn't just to the heretics, it's to everyone. It creates a climate of fear where people are afraid to think for themselves because they might end up with an unpopular opinion.
It kills the moral courage of the human mind.
Yes. Mill insists that you can't be a great thinker if you aren't willing to follow your intellect wherever it leads. And that sets up his second big argument. Let's assume the received opinion is actually true.
Okay, hypothesis 2. Even if our belief is 100% correct, we still shouldn't suppress dissent. Why not?
Because if that true opinion isn't fully, frequently, and fearlessly discussed, it becomes what he calls a dead dogma, not a living truth.
You hold it as a prejudice. You believe it, but you don't know why.
Right. It's just a superstition you happen to have inherited. The meaning of the idea itself starts to fade away. And this is especially true for complex topics like morality or politics. It's not like math where there's just one right answer.
These truths depend on balancing conflicting ideas.
And you have to understand the other side's best arguments, not just a straw man version. Mill says 99 out of 100 so-called educated men can't do this. They only know their own position.
He even says that if you don't have real opponents, you should invent them.
Yes. You have to imagine the strongest possible counter-arguments, like a devil's advocate, and wrestle with them. If you don't, the doctrine just becomes a hollow shell.
He uses Christian doctrines as an example.
A very powerful one. He says for most believers, ideas like judge not or blessed are the poor are just dead beliefs. They pay lip service to the words, but their actual behavior is guided by social custom.
Because there's no struggle anymore. The early Christians had a lively belief because they had to defend it every day. Once it becomes the default, unchallenged opinion, it loses its power.
And that leads to the third and, he says, most common case, that the conflicting ideas are actually both partial truths.
So it's not usually a case of one side being totally right and the other totally wrong.
Rarely. He says they usually share the truth between them. The popular opinion is often one side of the truth, just exaggerated, and the heretical opinion is usually the other side, the part that's been ignored or suppressed.
So you need both to get the full picture. Truth is found in the clash of ideas.
He uses politics as an example. You need a party of order or stability, and you need a party of progress or reform. If one completely dominates the other, society either stagnates or flies apart.
He even applies this to Christian morality, which is a bold move. He says it's incomplete, that it's a reaction against paganism, and it focuses too much on passive virtues, on what you shouldn't do.
Right. He argues it neglects things like public duty, personal dignity, magnanimity, things that you have to get from other sources, like the ancient Greeks and Romans. We need a diversity of ethics to be morally whole.
So to sum up, he's given 4 reasons for freedom of opinion. 1, the silenced opinion might be true. 2, it might be false, but debating it keeps the true opinion alive.
3, and most likely, the competing opinions both contain a piece of the truth, and you need to hear both. And 4, without debate, the meaning of the true doctrine is lost.
He also touches on the manner of discussion, saying, we can't really legislate politeness.
Yeah, he says that's a losing game. The people with the unpopular view are always going to be accused of being uncivil anyway. The real offense, he says, is to stigmatize your opponents as immoral or wicked just because they disagree with you.
And this whole robust defense of free thought naturally lead into the next chapter, which is about the freedom to act on those thoughts.
Right. So in chapter 3, Mill makes the logical jump.
Yeah.
If we need freedom of opinion, then we also need the freedom to act on our opinions, to run what he calls experiments of living.
As long as we do it at our own risk and peril, meaning as long as we're not harming other people.
Exactly. Because freedom of action is just as vital as freedom of thought. He says that if a society is ruled only by tradition and custom, then a key ingredient of human happiness and progress is just gone.
He brings in another thinker here, Wilhelm von Humboldt.
Yes, and it's a really important quote. Humboldt says the goal of human existence is the highest and most harmonious development of his powers. And to get there, you need two things: freedom and a variety of situations.
Now, he's not saying custom is useless.
Not at all. Tradition is a record of past experience. It's useful. But a mature person has to interpret that experience for themselves. If you just follow custom because it's custom, you're not using your human faculties. You're not using judgment or reason or moral preference.
He says the person who lets the world choose their life for them only needs the ape-like faculty of imitation.
It's a harsh line, but it makes his point. The person who chooses their own path is using everything they have. They're building character.
This is where he uses that great metaphor about the machine and the tree.
It's so powerful.
Yeah.
Human nature is not a machine to be built according to a plan. It's a tree that needs to grow and develop on all sides according to its own internal forces.
And for that to happen, you need strong feelings, strong desires.
Yes. Mill totally rejects the idea that strong impulses are a bad thing. He says strong impulses are just energy. The problem isn't strong desires, it's a weak conscience. We need passionate people, not bland, inert ones.
A person with strong, self-governed desires has a character. Someone who just follows the crowd has no character, no more than a steam engine has a character.
And he's worried that his society is suffering from a lack of personal impulse. People are always asking, what should I do? Instead of, what do I want to do?
And he traces this back to a certain kind of moral philosophy, what he calls the Calvinistic theory.
Which basically sees self-will as a sin. The goal is to crush your own nature and obey. It's all about conformity.
And he contrasts that with what he calls pagan self-assertion, the Greek ideal of self-development. Mill says we need both. That cultivating your individuality within the bounds of not harming others is what makes a human being noble and beautiful.
And any system that crushes that individuality, whatever you call it, is a form of despotism.
But what about people who don't feel the need to be original? How do you convince them that individuality is good for them?
Mill argues that originality is the salt of the earth. Even if you're not a genius, you need geniuses. You need innovators to discover new truths, to show a better way of living.
And genius can only breathe in an atmosphere of freedom.
Absolutely. If geniuses are forced to conform, society gets nothing from them. If they defy conformity, they get called eccentric or wild.
This is where he gets to what he sees as the biggest danger of his time, the ascendancy of mediocrity.
Yeah. Public opinion is king, and public opinion is, by definition, the opinion of the average person, the mediocre mind.
All the really wise and noble things, he says, start with individuals. The average person's role is to be able to follow that lead. But if the average person stamps out the innovators, then progress just stops.
Which is why he says eccentricity is so important. In a society that demands conformity, just daring to be different is a service. It helps break the spell of custom.
And we have to remember that people are different. They need different things to flourish. You can't force everyone into the same mold any more than you can force everyone to wear the same size shoes.
This is where he brings in that really scary warning about China.
Right. A nation with so much talent, but it became stationary for thousands of years. Why?
Because the despotism of custom is complete. And he's worried Europe is heading the same way, with everyone reading the same things, wanting the same things. He says Europe is at risk of becoming another China unless individuality fights back.
Because in the end, the worth of a state is just the worth of the individuals in it.
Exactly. And that brings us to chapter 4, where he has to start drawing some really specific lines in the sand.
Okay, so this is where the theory has to get practical. Mill restates his two main principles. 1, you're the absolute ruler over the part of your life that only concerns you.
And 2, society has authority over the part of your life that concerns society.
So what do we owe society? He says it's basically 2 things. Don't harm the interests of others that should be considered rights, and
you have to bear your fair share of the work and sacrifice needed to defend society. And society can absolutely force you to do those things.
But beyond that, for anything that only affects you or affects others with their full consent, you should have perfect freedom.
And he wants to be clear, this isn't a doctrine of selfish indifference. We should absolutely encourage each other to be better, to develop our faculties. But we do it through persuasion, not force.
And the reason for that is so simple, but so powerful. You know your own feelings and circumstances better than anyone else.
Immeasurably better is his phrase. Any attempt by society to micromanage your personal life is based on general ideas that are probably going to be wrong in your specific case.
Okay, but what about the consequences? If someone acts foolishly or has bad taste, what can society do?
They can show their distaste. They can avoid that person's company. They can warn others about them. Those are the natural and spontaneous consequences.
But they can't punish them.
Right, because those are personal failings, faults of prudence.
Right.
They aren't immoralities because they don't violate anyone else's rights.
And this is where we get to the biggest challenge to the whole principle, the contingency objection.
The no man is an island argument.
Exactly. If a person drinks too much, they might neglect their family. If they spend all their money, their kids might go hungry. Their actions have ripple effects. So isn't all self-harm really other regarding harm?
It's the stickiest point in the whole essay. And if this objection holds, the whole principle kind of falls apart.
So how does Mill get out of it?
With a very, very careful distinction. He says if your personal vice causes you to fail in a specific, definable duty to someone else, like you fail to pay your debts or support your children, then society can punish you.
But, and this is the key, right? They're punishing you for the breach of duty, not for the personal vice that led to it.
Exactly. You're punished for failing to pay your debts, not for being extravagant. You're punished for neglecting your children, not for being a drunk. That distinction keeps the private sphere private.
What about the bad example argument that we have to stop people from doing things because it might influence others?
Mill says society just has to live with that risk for the sake of freedom. Besides, if the conduct is really that bad, then seeing the negative consequences should serve as a warning, not an encouragement.
His real fear is that if you let the public interfere in personal matters, they'll just start imposing their own preferences on everyone.
Yes. They'll start claiming that your personal choices injure them just because they find them offensive. And that leads to this idea he calls the theory of social rights.
Which he thinks is monstrous.
Completely. It's the idea that I have a right to demand that you live up to my standards because your imperfection offends me or makes my life harder. He says if you accept that logic, there is no limit to tyranny.
It's the logic of persecution.
And he gives a bunch of examples of how this plays out, like religious rules. A Muslim majority might try to ban pork, not because it harms them, but because it offends their religion. That's illegitimate.
He talks about Sabbatarianism in his own country.
Right. Laws that restricted what you could do on a Sunday. He said the only justification for those laws is to make sure workers get a day off. Banning amusements just because the majority's religion says so is an abuse of power.
He also brings up sumptuary laws, laws against luxury.
And the more modern version of that, in unions, where the majority of average workers might try to hold back the best workers from earning more to enforce a kind of equality. He says if you give the public power over private life, that kind of tyranny is perfectly logical.
And the biggest example for him was the push for prohibition, the Maine law.
Yes, because the argument for it was based on this social rights idea. Advocates were literally saying the existence of liquor stores infringes on my right to security and my right to moral development.
And Mill's response is that this is an outrageous claim to be everyone else's moral guardian.
It has to be resisted. And its final example is Mormonism and polygamy.
This one is tricky. He personally thinks polygamy is terrible for women, that it's a step backward.
He does. He sees it as a violation of liberty. But he says, because the Mormons went off to a remote desert and, crucially, allowed people to leave freely, the outside world has no right to intervene with force. You can't force a community to be civilized just because you disapprove of them.
So in the final chapter, Mill tries to apply these principles to some really messy, real-world situations where the line between self-regarding and other-regarding is blurry.
Yeah, he's testing the limits of his own ideas. He starts by clarifying that some harm is just a part of life.
Like in a competition, if I get a job, someone else doesn't. That's a harm to them, but it's a legitimate one. Society only steps in if I win by cheating or using force.
And trade itself is a social act, so it can be regulated. He supports free trade, but on grounds of utility because it's usually more efficient. But the government can absolutely step in to prevent fraud or enforce safety standards for workers.
But the line gets crossed when the government interferes with the sale to try and stop people from using the product, like prohibition again, or putting heavy restrictions on things like poisons.
Right, because that infringes on the buyer's liberty. You're regulating the private act of consumption through the social act of selling.
This gets into police powers, preventing crime and accidents. He says, of course, if you see someone about to walk onto a bridge that's out, you can physically stop them.
Because liberty is about doing what you desire, and nobody desires to fall into a river. But if it's just a risk, not a certainty, like someone wants to do a dangerous job, you can warn them, but you can't stop them. They're the judge of their own risk.
What about poisons? This is a great example of his nuance.
It is. He says you need precautions. Labeling is fine. But requiring a doctor's note for everything goes too far and hurts people who need it for legitimate reasons. So he proposes this idea of pre-appointed evidence.
Which means?
The seller just has to write down who bought it, when, how much, and for what purpose. It doesn't really stop anyone from buying it for a good reason, but it creates a paper trail that would deter almost anyone thinking of using it for a crime.
That's brilliant. It's a way to protect society with a minimal impact on liberty.
It's a perfect balancing act. And he applies this same logic to things like drunkenness. Being drunk isn't a crime. But if a person has a history of being violent when they're drunk, then for that person, getting drunk is a crime against public safety.
The context changes everything. It's not the personal vice, but the predictable harm to others.
Right. And then he tackles the really thorny issue of instigation. What about things like gambling houses? If gambling is allowed, can you punish the person who runs the casino?
He finds this really difficult. He calls it a moral anomaly. It seems hypocritical to let the gambler go free but punish the casino owner.
He doesn't really land on a firm answer, but he suggests that if society has to do something, it should be about limiting the public nature of it. Maybe require them to be secret so people have to actively seek them out, rather than being tempted by them on every corner.
What about taxes as a way to discourage behavior?
He says taxing things like alcohol for revenue is okay. But he's very against using licensing laws to limit the number of bars just to make it harder for people to drink.
Why? That seems like a common public health strategy.
Because he says it treats the working classes like children. It's a paternal government telling them it knows best, instead of a free country where people are expected to have self-control.
Okay. Then he moves to contracts. He says you can't have the freedom to give up your freedom.
Right. A contract to sell yourself into slavery is void. Because the whole point of freedom is to preserve your ability to be free in the future. Giving that away permanently defeats the purpose.
And he applies this to marriage as well, saying it shouldn't be a contract that's binding forever if it just causes misery.
Which then brings him to the family. And this is where he argues that people often get liberty completely backward. People are so protective of parental power more than they are of liberty itself.
He argues the state must compel education.
Absolutely. He says bringing a child into the world without being able to give them an education is a moral crime against the child and against society.
But, and this is a huge but, the state should never be the one providing that education.
Never. State-run education for him is a machine for making everyone the same. It's a despotism over the mind. It's how you end up like China.
So the state's role is just to enforce it.
Yes. Enforce it through public exams that test for facts and basic knowledge, but never, ever try to influence opinions on controversial topics like religion or politics. You get educated citizens, but not uniform ones.
He even goes so far as to say the state can legitimately forbid people from marrying if they can't prove they can support a family.
Because having a child you can't support is a direct harm to that child. It's not a self-regarding act.
Finally, he gives 3 big reasons to limit government power, even in cases where it isn't strictly violating liberty.
First, a practical one. Individuals often just do things better than the government. That's the core argument for free markets.
Second, it's good for us. Running local institutions, serving on juries, that's the practical education of a free people. It teaches us how to govern ourselves.
And third, the most important one, the massive political danger of making the government too big and powerful. If you centralize everything, you create this giant bureaucracy.
And everyone becomes dependent on it. The public loses the ability to do anything for themselves. They just wait for instructions from the central office.
It creates a passive, helpless population. So his ideal is the greatest dissemination of power, consistent with efficiency, but the greatest possible centralization of information. The government should be a resource, a clearinghouse of knowledge, but not the manager of everything.
Because he ends with this really stark warning, a state that dwarfs its men to make its administration a little more efficient.
We'll find that with small men, no great thing can really be accomplished. It will have sacrificed the very vital power that makes progress possible.
So Mill's ultimate message is that freedom, individuality, even eccentricity, they aren't just nice things to have. They're essential fuel for human progress. Without them, we just stagnate.
And that really leaves us with the question he was asking back then, which feels more urgent than ever now. In a world that pushes so hard for conformity, through social media, through big institutions, how do we as individuals find the courage to actually use the liberty Mill fought for? How do we make sure we don't become a society that's just too afraid to be eccentric and in the process lose the very thing that makes us great? That's the challenge.